Dilbert in real life? I mean, are you the real Dilbert?
Sadly, there's a bit of Dilbert in me, yes. I've
In the
calculated.
quiet hours of a January morning in Northern California, the man who once made millions of office workers laugh was lying in a silent room, his body failing faster than his mind. Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, was no longer surrounded by newsrooms, critics, or debate panels, only the steady rhythm of hospice care and the knowledge that time had nearly run out. For decades, his cartoons mocked corporate absurdity with surgical precision. But in his final hours, there was no punchline. No strip to publish. Only a final message written days earlier, calm and deliberate, ending with a sentence that would soon divide the world: "I had an amazing life." How did a cultural icon of workplace rebellion end his life in such isolation, shadowed by controversy, illness, and public rejection? Why did the man who built his career exposing broken systems become a symbol of one himself? And more importantly, what really happened in the final hours of Scott Adams, when the noise of fame faded, and only the truth of a life remained? This is not the story of how Dilbert was created. This is the story of how it all ended. The news broke quietly at first, not with sirens or flashing headlines, but with a trembling voice on a live stream. Scott Adams's former wife, Shelley Miles, sat in front of a camera, fighting back tears as she read words he had written himself days earlier. There was no spin, no attempt to soften the moment. Just a simple confirmation that the man behind Dilbert was gone. Within hours, the silence vanished. Major news outlets across the United States and beyond published the same stark headline: the creator of Dilbert had died at 68 after a battle with metastatic prostate cancer. For some, it was the loss of a cultural figure who once captured the daily frustrations of modern work life better than anyone else. For others, it was the final chapter of a deeply polarizing public figure whose last years had been dominated by controversy. Social media split almost instantly. One side shared old Dilbert strips, screenshots of yellowed office humor that once felt universal, jokes about pointless meetings, incompetent bosses, and the quiet despair of cubicle life. Former fans wrote about how those cartoons had made them feel seen, how they had laughed at their desks when laughter was the only form of resistance they had. The other side responded with anger, reminders, and rejection. They reposted clips and quotes from Adams's final years, pointing to remarks that had cost him his syndication and shattered his standing with much of the mainstream press. For them, his death did not erase the harm they believed he had caused. Sympathy, they argued, did not mean absolution. In between these two camps stood a larger, quieter audience, people trying to reconcile both versions of Scott Adams at once. The sharp observer of corporate nonsense. And the men who, in his final chapter, became a symbol of how quickly influence can turn into isolation. Political figures weighed in as well. Donald Trump, whom Adams had openly praised and defended in recent years, posted a message calling him a great influencer who had fought bravely against a terrible disease. The post itself became another flashpoint, reigniting arguments about Adams's politics even as his body was still warm. What made this moment different was not just who Scott Adams had been, but what his death represented. This was not the passing of a retired artist remembered only for past achievements. This was a death that reopened unresolved questions about free speech, accountability, and the fragile line between provocation and self-destruction in the digital age. It forced the public to confront an uncomfortable idea, that a single life could leave behind two legacies, each claiming to be the real one. And as tributes and condemnations collided online, one fact remained unavoidable. Whatever people thought of Scott Adams at the end, his death was not a footnote. It was a cultural aftershock, one that demanded a closer look at how he got there, and what had been quietly unfolding long before that live stream ever went live. Long before Scott Adams became a lightning rod for controversy, he was a quiet observer, growing up in the Catskills of New York, far removed from the cultural battles that would later define his name. Born in 1957, the son of a postal worker and a real estate broker, Adams learned early how systems worked, and how often they failed the people trapped inside them. He was not groomed for fame. His path was methodical, almost conservative in its predictability. A bachelor's degree from Hartwick College. An MBA from UC Berkeley. Jobs that paid the bills. Desks that came with fluorescent lighting and rigid hierarchies. By the time he landed at Pacific Bell in California, Adams had absorbed something far more valuable than artistic technique, a deep, lived understanding of corporate absurdity. The cartoons came almost by accident. During slow hours, Adams doodled at his desk, simple figures, exaggerated noses, sharp angles. What began as idle sketches slowly formed a world that felt uncomfortably familiar to anyone who worked an office job. Meetings that produced nothing. Managers promoted beyond competence. Employees smart enough to see the problem, but powerless to fix it. When Dilbert debuted in 1989, it didn't explode overnight. It crept. It spread cubicle by cubicle, photocopied, taped to office walls, shared in break rooms. By the early 1990s, it had become something rare, a comic strip that didn't comfort readers, it validated their frustration. As the tech boom surged, Dilbert became a mirror for an entire workforce. By 1994, it was syndicated in hundreds of newspapers. Adams left corporate life behind and stepped fully into the role of creator, commentator, and reluctant spokesperson for white-collar discontent. Success followed quickly. Books sold in the millions. The Dilbert principle reframed incompetence as a systemic feature, not a personal failure. Awards piled up. A television adaptation earned an Emmy nomination. For a time, Scott Adams seemed untouchable, an artist who had figured out how to turn cynicism into clarity. But embedded in that success was the first quiet fracture. Dilbert worked because Adams believed he understood systems better than the people running them. Over time, that confidence hardened into certainty. The observer slowly became the authority. The satirist, increasingly convinced that he saw truths others refused to acknowledge. As the media landscape shifted, Adams adapted faster than most of his peers. He built a website early. He published his email address inside the strip, inviting readers directly into his thought process. Blogs followed. Then podcasts. Then live streams. The distance between creator and audience collapsed. What had once been filtered through cartoon panels now arrived unedited, immediate, and raw. Opinions that might once have been softened by humor were delivered directly, stripped of irony. Politics, persuasion, power, all topics Adams had always circled, moved to the center of his identity. And as his voice grew louder, the balance that had sustained Dilbert for decades began to slip. By the mid-2010s, Scott Adams was no longer just the man who mocked broken systems. He was stepping directly into them, convinced that provocation itself was a form of clarity. The same confidence that once fueled his success now pushed him closer to a point of no return. Looking back, the seeds of the final chapter were already planted, not in the scandals to come, but in the belief that understanding a system meant standing above it. The collapse did not arrive as a single scandal. It unfolded slowly, almost invisibly at first, as Scott Adams's public identity drifted away from the comic strip that made him famous. What had once been a carefully constructed satire began to dissolve into something more volatile, personal commentary delivered without the protective distance of fiction. From around the mid-2010s, Adams turned increasingly toward political persuasion as both a fascination and a mission. He spoke less as a cartoonist and more as a self-styled analyst of power, influence, and narrative control. His blog posts grew sharper. His live streams more frequent. His tone more absolute. For some, this evolution felt natural. Adams had always been interested in how people think, how they are persuaded, how systems manipulate belief. But for many longtime readers, something essential was being lost. The humor that once united people across ideologies was now replaced by arguments that demanded allegiance. In 2016, Adams publicly predicted Donald Trump's election victory at a time when most analysts dismissed the idea outright. When Trump won, Adams's confidence hardened into conviction. He praised Trump as a master persuader and later published Win Bigly, a book that framed political success as psychological dominance rather than factual debate. The cover of the book said it all. Dogbert, the cynical manipulator from Dilbert, reimagined as a political force. What followed was a transformation that alarmed even those who had defended Adams's right to provoke. On his daily podcast and YouTube show, he questioned mainstream narratives on vaccines, public health, and history. He positioned himself as a truth-teller persecuted by institutions too fragile to tolerate dissent. Then came the moment that ended everything. In February 2023, during a live-stream discussion of a controversial poll, Adams described Black Americans as a hate group and urged white people to get the hell away from them. The remarks were unambiguous. The reaction was immediate. Within days, most major U.S. newspapers dropped Dilbert. Editors who had published the strip for decades severed ties almost simultaneously. Syndication partners released statements distancing themselves. The comic that once symbolized office frustration vanished from breakfast tables across the country. Adams did not retreat. He refused to apologize, later stating that the comments were intentional. Instead, he reframed the backlash as proof of systemic censorship. He relaunched the strip online as a subscription-only project, Dilbert Reborn, appealing directly to a smaller, more ideologically aligned audience. But the damage was irreversible. The broad, diverse readership that had sustained Dilbert for over 30 years was gone. In its place was a fragmented following, loyal but limited. Invitations dried up. Mainstream platforms closed their doors. And as Adams's influence narrowed, another enemy was advancing quietly inside his body. In May 2025, Adams revealed that he had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer that had spread to his bones. The announcement came not as a plea for sympathy, but as a statement of fact. He spoke clinically, almost defiantly, about the disease. Behind the composure, the reality was brutal. Bone metastases meant chronic pain, declining mobility, and a future measured in uncertainty. The man who once thrived on constant output now faced days shaped by fatigue and medical appointments. Even so, he continued to broadcast, to argue, to assert control through words. At one point, frustrated by delays in accessing a newly approved treatment, Adams publicly appealed to Donald Trump for help, accusing his health care provider of failing him. Trump responded publicly, promising to intervene. The exchange blurred the line between private desperation and public performance. By then, Scott Adams's world had shrunk dramatically. What remained was a man convinced he was right, isolated from former allies, and racing against a disease that no amount of persuasion could outmaneuver. The systems he once mocked were no longer theoretical. They were now hospital networks, treatment schedules, and the unyielding arithmetic of time. The collapse was complete, not in spectacle, but in attrition. And as his body weakened, Scott Adams began preparing for something he could no longer debate his way out of. As the year drew to a close, Scott Adams's world narrowed to a handful of rooms and a shrinking circle of people. The arguments that once filled his days were still there, but they no longer carried the same urgency. Cancer had a way of stripping time of abstraction. Each week became a calculation. Each morning, a negotiation with pain. By late December, Adams was receiving hospice care at his home in Northern California. The setting was quiet, almost deliberately ordinary. No hospital corridors. No cameras. Just the subdued rhythm of a life slowing down. According to those closest to him, his mind remained sharp even as his body failed. He could still speak clearly. He could still write. And he knew exactly where the road was leading. It was during this period that Adams made a deliberate choice. On January 1st, he sat down to write a final message. Not a confession. Not an apology. A statement. The tone was calm, almost detached, as if he were documenting a completed project rather than closing a life. He acknowledged the possibility that his body would fail before his mind. He listed what mattered to him, his work, his books, his audience. And he ended with a request that felt both humble and defiant, that if anyone had gained something from his work, they should pay it forward. Be useful. The message was not released immediately. It waited, sealed in time, while Adams continued to decline. In the days that followed, he spoke publicly less often. The live streams slowed. The cadence of his online presence softened. There were no dramatic final broadcasts, no farewell tour. Instead, there was a sense of withdrawal, a man conserving what little energy remained. Those who watched closely noticed small changes. Shorter statements. Longer pauses. Moments where the forceful certainty of earlier years gave way to something quieter. Not regret, exactly, but acceptance. Adams understood that the debates surrounding him would not end with his death. He understood that his name now carried weight in two directions at once. And yet, there is no evidence that he attempted to reshape that narrative in his final days. He did not issue clarifications. He did not walk anything back. What was said had been said. What mattered now was time. According to reports, his condition worsened rapidly in the final stretch. The pain increased. Movement became difficult. Conversations grew shorter. Hospice staff focused on comfort, on easing symptoms rather than fighting the inevitable. Friends and family moved through the space quietly, aware that every visit might be the last. There were no public sightings. No photographs. The man who once thrived in constant visibility was disappearing from view. Somewhere in those final days, the public version of Scott Adams, the provocateur, the commentator, the lightning rod, began to fade. What remained was simply a human being confronting the same end faced by everyone else, stripped of platform and audience. The systems he had analyzed for decades no longer mattered. Algorithms could not extend his life. Influence could not negotiate with biology. The control he once exercised through words was slipping away. And as the calendar turned, the final countdown had already begun. What is known about Scott Adams's final 24 hours comes not from spectacle, but from fragments, quiet reports, careful statements, and the measured language of hospice care. There were no cameras in the room. No dramatic final exchange captured for the world. Only time, passing slowly. In the final day, Adams remained at home in Northern California, under hospice supervision. According to those familiar with the situation, his condition had deteriorated noticeably. The cancer that had spread to his bones left him weak, exhausted, and in constant discomfort. Hospice staff focused on pain management and calm, keeping the room dim, the environment steady, the hours predictable. It is understood that his mind was still largely intact. He had prepared for this moment days earlier, putting his thoughts into writing when he still could. By the last day, there was little left to say publicly. No final post. No last broadcast. The arguments had ended. The persuader had gone quiet. The room itself was unremarkable, ordinary furniture, muted light, the soft mechanical sounds that accompany end-of-life care. Outside, the world moved on. News cycles refreshed. Social feeds scrolled. Inside, the rhythm slowed to breathing, pauses, and long stretches of silence. Those close to him knew what the signs meant. At some point during those final hours, Adams slipped in and out of consciousness. Conversations, if there were any, were brief. There are no verified reports of final spoken words, no recorded last requests. What remains clear is that his passing was not sudden. It was the end of a long, exhausting decline. When Scott Adams died, it did not happen in front of an audience. There was no countdown, no public timestamp. His death was confirmed only after it had already occurred, quietly, definitively. The announcement came later, delivered by his former wife in a live stream that felt almost out of time with the internet era. Her voice shook as she read the message Adams had written in advance. The words were steady. Controlled. Final. If you are reading this, things did not go well for me. In that sentence was an acknowledgement that no persuasion, no argument, no influence had been enough to change the outcome. His body had failed before his mind, just as he had predicted. By the time the world learned of his death, the moment itself was already gone. There would be no opportunity to reinterpret it, no chance to interrupt it with debate. The final hours belonged only to him. What remained was everything that came after. The moment Scott Adams's death became public, the arguments that had surrounded him in life rushed back into the open. There was no pause for consensus, no shared language of mourning. Instead, the world reacted the way it had learned to react to Adams himself, by splitting. Journalists retraced the final timeline with caution. There was no criminal investigation to launch, no suspicious circumstances to examine. The cause of death was clear and undisputed: metastatic prostate cancer, an illness Adams had spoken about openly months earlier. Hospice care, end-of-life planning, a prepared statement, everything pointed to a medically expected conclusion. And yet, controversy found its way in anyway. Some questioned the role of the health care system Adams had publicly criticized. In his final months, he had accused his provider of delaying access to a newly approved treatment, claiming bureaucratic failure had robbed him of time. Supporters echoed the claim, framing his death as an example of systemic breakdown, the very kind Adams had spent his career exposing. Others pushed back, noting the aggressive nature of the disease and the lack of evidence that any intervention would have changed the outcome. For them, the healthcare debate was less about facts and more about Adams's habit of turning personal struggle into public confrontation. Political reaction only intensified the divide. Donald Trump's public condolences, calling Adams a great influencer and praising his loyalty, became another flashpoint. Critics argued that the message attempted to canonize a figure whose final years were marked by rhetoric many found unacceptable. Supporters saw it as a simple acknowledgement of friendship and shared belief. Even Adams's final message became a battleground. "I had an amazing life," he wrote. To some, the line felt jarring, an act of defiance from a man who never recanted, never softened, never apologized. To others, it was the most honest thing he could have said, a declaration that fulfillment does not require universal approval. Was Scott Adams a cautionary tale about unchecked ego and the corrosive effects of constant provocation? Or was he a victim of an era that punishes those who refuse to retreat from their convictions? The debate spilled across social platforms, opinion columns, and comment sections, echoing the same unresolved questions that had followed Adams for years. Could the art be separated from the artist? Did his final actions erase decades of cultural impact, or did they simply reveal the cost of speaking without filters in a polarized age? There were no new revelations, no hidden documents, no last-minute reversals to uncover. The mystery was not in how Scott Adams died, but in how he would be remembered. In death, as in life, there was no single narrative strong enough to contain him. And as the noise slowly faded, one final question remained, hovering over the legacy he left behind. When everything is stripped away, fame, controversy, applause, outrage, what does a life ultimately amount to? When the arguments finally quieted, what remained of Scott Adams was not a verdict, but a question. For more than 3 decades, his work captured something painfully real about modern life. Dilbert did not just entertain, it named a shared experience. It gave language to frustration, humor to helplessness, and recognition to people who felt invisible inside vast corporate machines. For millions, those simple drawings were a reminder that they were not alone. That achievement cannot be erased. At the same time, neither can the final chapter be ignored. Scott Adams chose to speak without retreat, even when the cost was isolation. He chose conviction over reconciliation, certainty over ambiguity. In doing so, he forced the public to confront an uncomfortable truth: a person can be both insightful and destructive, both influential and deeply flawed. In his final message, Adams did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask to be understood. He asked something simpler: to be useful. Perhaps that is where his story ultimately settles. Usefulness does not require admiration. It does not demand consensus. It exists in the impact left behind, however complicated that impact may be. Scott Adams helped people see the systems they lived inside more clearly. He also demonstrated what happens when clarity turns into absolutism, when insight hardens into identity. In the end, his final hours were quiet. No debate. No audience. Just a human being reaching the same destination as everyone else. The cartoons remain. The controversies remain. The questions remain. And somewhere between laughter and discomfort, between admiration and rejection, Scott Adams's life stands as a reminder that legacy is rarely clean, and that the final moments of a life often reveal more than decades of success ever could.